He had crossed deserts that swallowed armies whole. He had broken empires that had stood for 2 centuries. He had walked into Persia, Egypt, Babylon, and every single time, the world bent toward him. But standing on the western bank of the Hydaspes River in the summer of 326 BC, Alexander the Great stared across the water at something he had never faced before. Not a Persian army, not a Greek city, not a mountain pass or a desert wind. 200 war elephants, each one the size of a small building, each one trained to destroy, each one belonging to a king named Porus, who, unlike every other ruler Alexander had encountered, had looked at the greatest conqueror in human history approaching his border and decided not to run. Porus stood his ground, and for the first time in his life, Alexander the Great had to stop and think. This is the Battle of the Hydaspes, the last great battle Alexander ever fought. The moment the edge of the known world pushed back. Nobody told you what it actually cost him. To understand what this battle meant, you have to understand where Alexander was standing when it happened. He was 30 years old. In 8 years of continuous campaigning, he had never slept in the same place for more than a few weeks. He had marched from Greece through Turkey, through Egypt, through Persia, through Afghanistan, through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, ranges that make the Alps look like a suggestion. And now he was in the Punjab, modern-day Pakistan, the northwestern edge of the Indian subcontinent. His men had been marching for 8 years. Think about that. Not 8 months. Not 8 seasons. 8 years of continuous warfare, sleeping in camps, watching friends die, moving always east, always forward, always toward whatever Alexander had decided was the next horizon. These were men who had been teenagers when they left Macedonia. They were approaching 30. Some of them had children they had never met, born from brief encounters in Persian cities or Afghan mountain towns. They were tired in the way that only years of continuous survival can produce. And the Hydaspes River was not cooperating. The river was swollen. The monsoon rains, something Alexander's army had never encountered before, coming from a temperate Mediterranean world, had turned the Hydaspes into a churning, fast-moving barrier, almost a mile wide in places. On the far bank, Porus had positioned his army with tactical intelligence. Cavalry spread along the bank to intercept any crossing point, war elephants at regular intervals creating a barrier that horses simply refused to approach. Alexander's horses were terrified of the elephants. He knew it. Porus knew it. The river was rising. The rain was not stopping. And across the water, Porus waited with an army of 30,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, and those 200 elephants that stood like a wall of living nightmare on the far bank. Alexander stood on his side of the river and ran a deception campaign for weeks. He moved troops along the bank at night, loudly making noise, forcing Porus to mobilize his army in response, then doing nothing. He did this repeatedly until Porus's scouts began to ignore the nighttime movements. He sent supply ships moving up and down the river, familiarizing the crossing with ordinary traffic until it seemed routine. He gathered boats from hundreds of miles of riverbank, hiding them in tributaries behind tall grass and riverine vegetation. He was not waiting for the river to drop. He was teaching his enemy to stop watching. Before we talk about the crossing, we need to talk about Porus. Because Porus is the part of this story that history consistently undervalues. King Porus, his actual name was likely Parava. Porus, being the Greek rendering, ruled a kingdom in the Punjab that was prosperous, organized, and militarily sophisticated. He had access to war elephants that his enemies did not. He understood the river crossing problem that Alexander faced better than anyone else. And when Alexander sent envoys demanding submission, the standard offer, the one every other ruler had eventually accepted, Porus sent them back with a message. He would meet Alexander at the river, with his army. This decision requires a certain quality that the ancient world called something close to greatness. Every ruler before Porus, Darius, the Persian king, who commanded the largest empire in the world, had eventually broken and run. Porus knew exactly who was coming across the water. He knew what Alexander had done to every army that stood against him. He knew about Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, and he chose to stand. He was, by ancient descriptions, physically enormous, close to 7 feet tall by Greek accounts, though ancient measurements require some skepticism. He wore an armor that fitted his scale. He rode the largest war elephant in his army. He was, in other words, a man who looked like a king even before the battle began. Alexander, watching Porus across the river, reportedly said something that echoed what he had said looking at Darius before Gaugamela, except this time it carried a different weight. He said, "I see a man worthy of a great contest. Here is what the textbooks usually tell you. Alexander found a crossing point 18 miles upstream, used a storm to cover the noise of his crossing, and got his cavalry across the river before Porus could respond. Here is what they usually leave out. The storm that covered the crossing was not just noise cover. It was a monsoon storm, the kind of violent, drenching, lightning-split downpour that the Mediterranean world had no framework for. Alexander's men were crossing a mile-wide churning river at night, in boats, in a monsoon storm, guided by almost no light, with the current trying to push them downstream, and the rain reducing visibility to the length of an arm. Some of the boats grounded on islands mid-river. The men had to wade through chest-deep water to reach dry land, holding weapons above their heads in the dark and the rain. This is not a military maneuver. This is an act of collective insanity performed by 6,000 people who trusted one man's judgment so completely that they stepped into a flooded river at midnight in a thunderstorm. Alexander was in the first boat. When they finally reached the north bank, soaking, exhausted, having survived the crossing, the cavalry still had to be unloaded. The horses, already nervous about elephants they could smell on the wind, had to be gotten off boats in darkness and rain and reformed into fighting order. And then Porus's son arrived with a scout force of 2,000 cavalry. He was quickly overwhelmed, but his retreat carried critical information back to Porus. Alexander himself had crossed. The main crossing was not the deception. The main crossing had already happened. Porus now faced a commander's nightmare. He had a large force watching the main bank downstream, a force he could not simply abandon because it might be the primary crossing. He had Alexander with cavalry and infantry already on his side of the river. He had to decide in minutes what to do with 200 war elephants, 30,000 soldiers, and a battle developing on ground he had not chosen. He made the right decision. He turned to face Alexander with his full army, leaving a minimal force at the main bank. The battle that followed was the hardest fight of Alexander's life. The battle, moments not movements. Forget the tactical overview. Focus on the moments. The elephant line. Porus positioned his elephants at intervals across the front of his infantry line, each elephant separated by about 30 meters of infantry, creating a wall that cavalry could not penetrate. Alexander's horses would not charge toward elephants. This was not a training failure. This was biology. Horses have an instinctive fear response to elephant scent that no amount of conditioning fully suppresses. Alexander could not use his companion cavalry, the decisive weapon of every battle he had ever fought, directly against the elephant line. So he changed the battle. He sent Caenus, one of his best cavalry commanders, on a wide flanking ride around the right side of Porus's army with half the companion cavalry. He himself took the other half against Porus's left-wing cavalry. When Alexander hit the left-wing cavalry, they retreated behind their own elephant line, exactly as he expected. The elephants and Porus's infantry pressed forward. The Macedonian infantry, the phalanx, faced the elephants directly. The phalanx against the elephants. This moment is recorded in every ancient source for the same reason. It was extraordinary. The Macedonian phalangites, armed with their 18-foot sarissa pikes, stood their ground as war elephants, animals weighing 5 to 7 tons each, trained for decades to fight, charged directly into their formation. They did not break. The sarissas extended at elephant height, jabbed at the animals' faces and trunks, the most sensitive points, the points that cause an elephant to check its charge. The elephants that pushed into the formation found themselves in a forest of pike shafts, unable to trample effectively, their handlers on top vulnerable to Macedonian missiles from the flanks. But some elephants broke through, and an elephant that breaks through a pike formation is a catastrophe in slow motion, an animal the size of a truck moving through a crowd of men at speed. Men were knocked aside, trampled, thrown. Units were disrupted. The phalanx, for the first time in Alexander's campaigns, did not function as the unstoppable geometric wall it normally was. The turn of the battle. Caenus arrived on the far side exactly when he was supposed to. The Indian cavalry, already pressed by Alexander from the front, found themselves flanked from behind. They retreated again toward the elephant line, which was now the worst place for them to be, because their own elephants, in the chaos of the phalanx engagement, were beginning to panic. Elephants that panic in battle are more dangerous to their own side than to the enemy. The mahouts, the handlers on top, lost control of some animals. The elephants began moving backward, then sideways, then in the random, terrifying directions that a panicking 5-ton animal moves. The Indian infantry, packed behind the elephant line, had nowhere to go. The Macedonian infantry pressed. The cavalry closed from both sides. The elephants, now largely out of control, were herded outward by the Macedonians using sarissa shafts and noise, a technique developed during the battle itself, improvised under fire. Porus fought until the end. He was on the largest elephant in his army, directing the battle, and he kept fighting after the battle was effectively over. He was wounded multiple times. He did not retreat. He was surrounded, and then Alexander sent him an envoy. Porus was brought before Alexander. He was still on his elephant. He was wounded. His army was destroyed. His son was dead, killed in the initial cavalry skirmish before the main battle. Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated. Porus looked at him from the height of his elephant and said, "As a king." 3 words, and they changed everything. Alexander did not execute him. He did not chain him. He did not parade him through captured cities as a symbol of Macedonian triumph. He gave him his kingdom back. Not just his original kingdom. Alexander expanded. He added new territory. He recognized Porus as a king in the fullest sense, as a satrap, as a ruler in his own right under Alexander's broader dominion. Why? Because Porus had given Alexander something no one else had in 8 years of conquest. He had fought him completely. He had made Alexander earn every inch of the Hydaspes. He had stood on his elephant while his army died around him and refused to run. In Alexander's world, built entirely on his own mythology of the great contest, the worthy opponent, the noble enemy, Porus was the first man who had fully played the role. The battle is also where Bucephalus died. Alexander's horse, the black stallion he had tamed as a boy, the horse that had carried him from Macedonia to India, died at the Hydaspes. Not in battle exactly. He was old. He was wounded. He had carried Alexander across rivers and through deserts and into the blade of Persian swords and down the gorges of Afghanistan. And he died here, at the edge of the world. Alexander founded 2 cities at the Hydaspes. One he named Nicaea, Victory. The other he named Bucephala. He named a city after his horse. And then it happened. 3 days after the battle, Alexander called his commanders together and announced the next objective. The Ganges River was ahead. Beyond the Ganges, more kingdoms, more territory, the ocean that ancient Greek cosmology believed was just beyond India, the edge of the world itself. He wanted to keep going. His army said no, not dramatically, not in a mutiny of swords and fire. The soldiers simply refused to march. They sat in their camps and they wept. Ancient sources record this specifically, the image of hardened veterans sitting in the rain and weeping, not from cowardice, but from a homesickness so deep and so long that it had become something else. A certainty, a wall inside them that Alexander could not breach with any speech or any promise or any display of his own willingness to keep going. Caenus, the same commander who had ridden the flanking cavalry at the Hydaspes, one of Alexander's most loyal and capable generals, spoke for the army. He said, "The men want to see their parents again, their wives, their children." Alexander was furious. He went to his tent and refused to eat for 3 days, his standard response to not getting what he wanted from a universe. He waited for the army to change its minds. They didn't. He turned west. He never went east again. He died 14 months later in Babylon, at 32 years old, from a fever, or from the accumulated weight of 8 years of the kind of living that bodies are not designed for. The last battle he ever fought was the Hydaspes. The army that stopped him was not Porus. It was the men who loved him. Closing. At the Granicus, he was 22 and invincible because he did not yet know what could stop him. At the Hydaspes, he was 30 and invincible because nothing except his own soldiers could. The river stopped him, not the elephants, not Porus, not the monsoon or the width of the water, or the 5-ton animals on the far bank. The men who had followed him across the entire known world looked east at one more river and said, "Not this one." And Alexander the Great, the man who had never lost a battle, never turned back, never accepted a limit, turned around. If you felt something watching that happen, if the weight of that eastward gaze that never crossed the Ganges landed somewhere real, then you already know where you belong. This is Untold Battlefield, where history bleeds truth. Subscribe, because the next battle we tell is the one that shows you what happens after the turning point.